Okay, so I want to go over a few things here on my Tamiya Dynastorm. A bit of an update. So I ran this a few weeks ago at RCHR, and it did okay, but it needs a bit of tuning. I changed. I used a less thick shock oil up front, so next time around maybe the front won't be so bouncy. And I also had to replace one of the rear hub carriers because it broke. Is it's the typical, crappy Tamiya plastic. I did use another stock plastic one on there, but I also bought these aluminum ones from Extra Speed. The thing is, the way that these mount using the super astute arms and the types of dog bones I have, I actually have to use this bottom hole right here. But the arms won't allow me to fit it like that unless I cut this piece out. So with these aluminum ones, I'm going to have to get my Dremel and a cutting wheel and cut out, this inner bottom hole here just to make it fit. So I haven't quite gotten around to that yet. But anyway, what I really want to talk about is the gearbox. So what's in here right now is the stock gearbox, if you will. Although it has been modified slightly in terms of the slipper clutch arrangement as well as the diff outdrives. So just to recap, these are the stock outdrives with the splines that go to the stock differential on the inside. And I had to Dremel out the openings in the outdrives to fit a pucks type dog bones, right? And these pucks... This does work, okay, but because this surface here is dremeled out, it's not perfectly smooth, and it does kind of beat up the pucks a little bit. So I would like to actually use a diff outdrive that was designed for pucks, like this one here. This is a Kyosho ball diff that I pulled out of maybe my RB6 or RT6. I just don't have, I'm not really using ball diffs anymore because I'm running on dirt anymore. And then I bought these diff halves, which I think are from the RB7, and they just bolt right in. And this gearbox here is a 3D printed gearbox for the Dynastorm. Man, for the life of me, I can't remember who makes it. But the guy's on Facebook, and he'll print this for anybody who wants them, and they're quite nice. And they come from Germany. So that will allow you to fit a modern ball diff in there, because the bearings that are used to mount a modern ball diff have, I think, a 15 millimeter inner diameter. Is that right? No, sorry, 10 millimeter in diameter, 15 millimeter outer diameter. So you need a 10 by 15 bearing. But the stock gearbox only fits, was it like an 8 by 12 bearing? It's very different. So anyway, this allows for that. But I also wanted to make a few other changes, and you can kind of see here how this looks a little different. I'm going to get to that shortly. So what some people have done to modernize their Dynastorm gearbox is to fit a TRF-201 input shaft and slipper clutch assembly to the gearbox. And presumably that works. I don't have a TRF-201, so I can't say. And the TRF-201 is also out of production. They don't make the parts anymore. You can barely find parts for it. So I wouldn't really even call that modernizing the gearbox, because you can't get parts. So what I did instead is I bought a Tamiya DN01 slipper clutch set, and it comes with the pads and plates and everything. It also comes with the input shaft. Now this input shaft on its own is incompatible with the input gear, I guess we would call it, that fits onto the input shaft. And the reason for that is because the input shaft you would put on this is a smaller tooth count than what you actually have to use in the Dynastorm. This, I believe, is a 28 tooth gear that has to go in here. Same thing for the stock gearbox, a 28 tooth gear. And it mounts in a very specific way. And this input shaft has a little hole right here that goes through the shaft with a pin. So you would need to find a gear that's 28 teeth, 48 pitch, that has that pin in there to allow you to mate it to this input shaft. And those, as far as I can tell, do not exist. So the other way to do it is to do what I did here. This is actually a pinion gear. It's a 28 tooth pinion gear with a 5mm bore on the inside, slots right in, and then with the grub screw, I just align the grub screw to the hole that goes through the shaft here, and I use blue thread lock and I tighten it down. I had thought about maybe drilling out the hole on the shaft and then tapping it with like a 3mm thread, so that way I can take a longer grub screw and kind of thread it through the pinion and then into that hole, so that way I get a better lockdown. But I don't have the right tools to really hold this down and drill straight through without any, cockeyedness or anything of the hole. So I had to do it this way. I did take, I think it was it's a Dremel bit that grinds metal, but it's kind of a conical shaped grinding bit, just to try to open up the top of that hole a little bit, so that I could push this grub screw in just a little bit into the top shaft. But really, just tightening that down and using a blue thread lock should be enough. So that's step one. Step two is getting all the right spacings in here. So these are just conventional Tamiya plastic bushings. So these are, I believe, 5x10 bushings. And I use bushings because they're lightweight. They're much lighter than bearings. And these aren't going to be, spinning at all. Okay, they're just used as spacers. And then from there, I have this here, which is, I believe, a 5x8 bearing on this side. And that's going to slot through and land on the inside of the housing here. And on the other side, I have another 5x8 bearing that goes on that side. So when this goes through, okay, as you can see, this part here is where the slipper clutch will mount, okay? And it's pretty reasonably spaced. So then what do we do on the other side? Well, on this side, it's going to mount here. The way the gearbox was made, this 3D printed one, was designed to basically replicate what is done on the stock Dynastorm part. So if I go to the manual here, let me just open this up, and it's a couple pages in. So if we go to the gearbox, right here. So this gear is going to go, this input shaft is going to slot all the way through, and then there's going to be this bearing right here. I think it's a 3x8 bearing, and then there's an E-clip on the other side that's going to hold that in. You can kind of sort of see it here, but that input shaft sticks out of the gearbox, and there's that E-clip that holds everything in place. That assumes that you have the stock top shaft or input shaft. So this is not that. Now it does have, at the very end of it, a sort of slot here where you could put an E-clip if you wanted to, but it would have to be aligned perfectly to this gearbox and the thickness of the bearing and the way this would go in. It doesn't quite make it. So I did something a little different. I used this. This is a 4x8 flanged bearing. So I'm just going to put this back on. I think it goes on, this way. So it's going to mount like so. So the flange goes on the inside here. Okay. And the bearing just slots right onto the end of the shaft, just like that. And this is going to go on from the inside of the gearbox. Now the way the gearbox was made, it's not supposed to work that way with the stock gearbox. So I did have to do some reaming. So I just basically took a reamer and I reamed out the material on the inside a little bit to make this fit. And in addition to let me rephrase that. Initially, I was experimenting with doing it, the flange bearing on the outside here. So I had cut this material, and that didn't quite work. So I had to mount it from the inside instead. And the way that this particular piece was printed is actually slightly misaligned to the mounting point for the bearings over here. So when you close everything up, this doesn't give you a nice smooth mesh. So I actually needed to ream this hole out just a little bit to allow this bearing to move just a little bit so that I get the right mesh between this gear in this idler gear when everything's all closed up. Okay, so I did have to take the reamer and just ream a little bit, put this in, check the mesh with everything closed up, open it up, ream it a little more, back and forth until I got it to work reasonably well. So this is all set now. So this is arguably a more modern version of a modernized Dynastorm gearbox, because the DN01 slipper clutch, you can still buy this. Okay? And this, 48 pitch, 28 tooth pinion with a 5mm bore, you can find those on eBay. These ball diffs here, I mean, you can get a Tamiya version of this. This just happens to be a Kyosho one I have lying around. You can get those too. So everything on here is stuff you can actually get today. So I will finish assembling this, and this is a lot of surgery to take this gearbox off, so I'm kind of debating as to whether or not I'm going to mount this, but I probably will. And so then I will have a properly modernized gearbox for the Dynastorm with a slipper clutch assembly, by the way, that is a proper slipper clutch assembly. You may recall the way that I had put this slipper clutch together. I don't actually have, even though I have pads on both sides, if I remember correctly, the hubs don't lock onto the top shaft from both sides. Trying to remember, there's something about this that I basically rely on a lot of pressure on this spring here to really press the plate against the slipper pad to get this to not slip, or to not slip too much. And there's very little tuning window here when I was testing this out on turf. So going to this arrangement will give me more tunability of the slipper clutch, which is always good. So I think that'll make things better. A bit more shock tuning will make this better. And I'm sure there's other stuff that's going to break too. I just haven't quite found it out yet. Other changes I made, I swapped out the caster blocks for Traxxas 30-degree caster blocks. These are the kinds that you can find on the TRX3, for example, and you can still find them on eBay. And then this also gives me a bit of tunability, because the gap inside the caster block to mount the spindle carrier is larger than the stock Tamiya unit. So you can take some spacers here and move this up or down as you please. But because of that, I actually the shaft that you would use with E-clips on either side to mount the spindle carrier isn't quite long enough to accommodate the fact that this caster block has a larger separation from the top to the bottom sort of ears here. So I just used a longer screw, just basically a 3mm screw. I don't remember how long, and then a little nylon nut on the top to lock everything down, and that should do just fine. So this should be stronger. These arms I went over these arms before. Everything on this should be pretty much good to go. My only real worry here is the front tower. As you can see, the way it mounts is quite wobbly. There's not much I can do about that, because when this screw goes through and mounts onto the tower, you're not locking it on the back with a nut. There's actually one of those dumb little things. I can't even remember what it's called, but it's let me see. Let me get the manual out again. I talked about this, I think, in the first Dynastorm video. Let me find a good example. These guys right here. I hate these things. The press nuts. So there's two of these press nuts on the back of that front tower. And you can't take them out. Once they're in there, they're in there. And so the way, however those threads are aligned on the press nut is going to determine how this mounts to the tower, because this tower also has threads in these holes here where this screw goes in, and that thread is going to have a certain alignment, and the press nut thread might be off by a certain theta, a certain number of degrees. So you have to, you got to make sure this screw is coming just out of the front bulkhead, that you're screwing into that press nut as soon as possible, and there's no gap, because you can't keep screwing this screw tighter to reduce this gap spacing, because this is also threaded. So there's some play in here, and I figure, okay, well, maybe I can put a washer in between them, but then the washer would reduce the total surface area between the tower and the bulkhead, and that could actually make it break more easily. So I'll have to figure out some kind of solution here, maybe just a fixed spacer or something to brace this up. Or if I could find a way to take those press nuts out and then just put a lock gun in there, that would be ideal. But in any case, figuring this out piece by piece. So far I like it though. I did like the way it drove on the track, with some exceptions for the way it was, you know, the suspension was a little too stiff. But yeah, that's it for now. Main thing was the gearbox. This is how I'm going to do the modified gearbox. And thanks for watching.